The building sat on the edge of campus, like a quiet warehouse. Concrete walls, flat roof, no windows on the lower floor. Officially, it was the Applied Materials Research Center. But inside, it felt closer to a machine shop than a university lab. Most mornings began the same way. Delivery trucks backed up to the loading bay. Graduate students shuffled in with coffee and backpacks. Air compressors hummed somewhere behind the walls. Nothing dramatic ever happened here. The corridors smelled faintly of ethanol and dust. Metal carts rattled across tile floors. Safety posters warned about solvents and lasers. A typical American research lab. Quiet funding, quiet experiments. But one room always felt slightly different. Room 214 housed a clean bench used for microparticle work. The room had strict rules. No food, no paper, no unnecessary contact with surfaces. Every object was wiped before entering. On the glass isolation chamber in the center of the room, technicians sometimes noticed something strange. Not fingerprints exactly, more like ghost smudges. Thin branching patterns appeared on the glass surface. They looked almost like frost spreading across a cold window. The odd part was timing. They appeared after the glass had been cleaned, and sometimes they formed without anyone touching the chamber at all. Most people blamed bad cleaning solution, but one technician noticed something else. The patterns always appeared after someone pulled off their nitrile gloves. No one wrote it down. The lab had bigger projects to worry about. The morning Daniel died started like every other Tuesday. He arrived before 8. Security cameras showed him swiping his badge at the lab entrance. He carried a backpack and a plastic coffee cup. Nothing unusual. He walked the same hallway he had walked for 6 years. At 9:12 a.m., the fire alarm triggered in room 214, not smoke. A chemical sensor spike. Campus police arrived first. The door was locked from the inside. Through the glass window, they could see Daniel collapsed beside the workbench. By the time paramedics forced the door open, he was already gone. No gunshot, no knife wound. The medical examiner later wrote a careful sentence in the report. Suspected exposure to toxic compound. The room itself looked almost untouched. Equipment still powered on, instruments running quietly. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. But detectives noticed something on the glass chamber. A clear fingerprint, sharp ridges, perfect pattern. They ran it through the system. It matched a man named Marcus. Marcus worked in another building across campus. Different department, different project. He had never signed into this lab. Security logs confirmed it. His key card never opened the door, yet his fingerprint sat clearly on the glass chamber next to Daniel's body. Not smudged, not partial. A perfect print, exactly where someone would place their hand while leaning over the bench. The problem was simple. Marcus had never touched that glass, not once. University administration reacted fast. Too fast, some people thought. Campus security conducted an internal investigation. They checked cameras, badge logs, and lab access records. The story they presented 2 days later sounded neat and complete. Marcus had visited the lab weeks earlier. During that visit, investigators claimed he must have touched the glass chamber. His fingerprint stayed on the surface. Later, Daniel accidentally released a toxic chemical during an experiment. Tragic accident. Wrong place, wrong timing. Case closed. It sounded plausible to anyone outside a laboratory. Fingerprints can remain on glass for days, sometimes longer if the room is dry and undisturbed. Detectives have seen prints survive even weeks under the right conditions. The report explained it that way. Marcus's fingerprint was old. Daniel's death was unrelated. No foul play. University lawyers approved the statement. Local police accepted the conclusion. The death was ruled an industrial accident during research work. Marcus was briefly questioned and released. News coverage lasted exactly 1 news cycle. Lab accident claims researcher. The campus moved on quickly. Funding proposals still had deadlines. Experiments still needed to run. But one person reading the report felt something was wrong. Not the death, the fingerprint. Because in real labs, fingerprints almost never survive that clean, especially not on glass cleaned daily with ethanol and wipes. Alan Brooks did not work for the police. He worked for courts. His job was simple to describe and hard to do well. When science appeared in a criminal case, Alan explained whether the science actually made sense. Some weeks he testified about blood spatter. Other weeks it was chemical contamination or lab procedures. His reports were known for one thing. They annoyed everyone equally. Prosecutors hated him when he questioned evidence. Defense attorneys hated him when he confirmed it. Alan's rule was blunt. Physics doesn't care about your theory. He was sitting in his small office near downtown Baltimore when the email arrived. The subject line read, "Consult request, fingerprint anomaly." Attached was the campus investigation file. Alan opened it, expecting a routine lab accident, but one photo stopped him. The fingerprint on the glass chamber, it was almost too perfect. Clear ridges, sharp edges, no smear marks from pressure or sliding. That alone bothered him. Real fingerprints left during contact usually distort slightly. Skin moves, fingers shift, surfaces flex. This one looked printed. Alan opened the cleaning protocol for the lab. Ethanol wipe every 4 hours. Surface cloth every morning. He leaned back in his chair. Fingerprints don't survive that routine, not for weeks, which meant the official explanation had a problem, a big one. The request to review the case came from a public defender. Marcus was now a suspect again. When the toxicology results came back, Daniel's death looked less like an accident. The compound in his bloodstream wasn't something that escaped from equipment. It had been deliberately introduced. Poison. And Marcus's fingerprint on the chamber suddenly mattered again. Alan stared at the file late into the evening. 2 explanations existed. The first option was simple. Marcus had entered the lab somehow without a key card and left the print during the murder. That meant security logs, cameras, and door sensors all failed. Possible, but extremely unlikely. The second option was worse. The fingerprint had been planted. That idea sounded ridiculous at first. Fingerprints are considered one of the most reliable forms of physical evidence. You cannot easily fake them on glass surfaces. At least that was the assumption. But the photo still bothered him. The ridges were too clean, too uniform. Alan printed the image and placed it beside several real latent prints from past cases. They didn't look the same. He closed the folder slowly. If the fingerprint had been planted, the method had to be unusual. Not ink, not a mold, something else. And that meant the investigation was only beginning. Alan started where every forensic scientist starts, the surface. He visited the lab 3 days later. Campus police escorted him through the building and into room 214. The glass chamber still stood in the center of the room. The fingerprint had already been lifted for evidence, but Alan wasn't interested in the missing print. He was interested in the glass itself. He put on gloves and walked slowly around the chamber. Clean surface. No scratches, no dust. He asked a technician to demonstrate the cleaning routine. Ethanol spray, wipe, dry cloth. The glass ended spotless. Then Alan asked something unusual. Take your gloves off. The technician looked confused, but complied. He snapped off the nitrile gloves and tossed them into the trash. Alan waited. 10 seconds passed. Then he leaned toward the glass under a bright inspection lamp. A faint branching pattern appeared on the surface. Thin lines, almost invisible, like frost forming across a window. The technician frowned. That happens sometimes, she said. Static or something. Alan felt a small spark of interest. Show me again. She removed another glove. Snap. A soft crackle of static electricity. And once again, the faint pattern spread slowly across the glass. Alan smiled slightly. Most people think fingerprints are just sweat and oil. But there is another force at work, one that almost no detective ever considers. Electric charge. Alan left the lab with a notebook full of questions. Static electricity explained the ghost patterns on the glass, but it did not explain a perfect fingerprint belonging to a man who was never in the room, at least not yet. Back in his office, Alan started reading everything he could find about the lab itself. Grants, projects, staff lists, research topics, the usual background work. Most of it looked routine, until he noticed something odd in the equipment inventory. The lab owned a triboelectric aerosol generator. It was not common equipment. Most chemistry labs didn't need one, but particle researchers sometimes used it to study how tiny charged particles move through air. Alan wrote the name down. Triboelectric. The word meant something very specific in physics. When 2 materials rub together, electrons jump between them. One surface becomes positively charged, the other becomes negative. That tiny imbalance creates static electricity. But in the right conditions, it can do more than shock your hand on a doorknob. It can move particles through the air. Alan opened the lab's recent purchase records. The aerosol generator had been used heavily during the past 3 months, mostly at night, mostly by a small group of researchers on the same grant project as Daniel. He circled another name in the usage log. Lisa, Daniel's project partner. At first, the connection meant nothing. Researchers share equipment all the time. That alone proved nothing. Still, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that the strange fingerprint and the particle generator belonged somewhere in the same story. He just didn't know how yet. 2 days later, Alan visited the campus cafeteria, not for food. For conversation, graduate students are the best source of accidental information in any research lab. They complain constantly, and complaints often contain truth. Alan sat with a group from the materials department. They talked about deadlines, funding, and broken instruments. Eventually, someone mentioned Daniel. The table fell quiet for a moment. Then one student shrugged. Honestly, the grant fight was worse than the accident. Alan looked up. What fight? The student hesitated. then lowered his voice. You didn't hear this from me, but that new federal grant, $20 million for particle deposition research. Another student added, whoever controls the project gets the funding. Daniel was supposed to lead the next phase, the first student said, but Lisa wanted control of the lab. Alan stirred his coffee slowly. Control how? The student laughed softly. In academia, control means authorship, patents, and the grant money. Alan nodded politely, but his mind had already moved elsewhere. Particle deposition, charged particles, triboelectric equipment, fingerprints, the pieces were still separate. But now they sat closer together. And then the cafeteria worker passed their table carrying a tray of plastic cups. As she stacked them, the cups clung together slightly. Static electricity, one student joked. Dry air turns everything into a magnet. Alan froze for a moment. Not a magnet, an electrostatic attractor, and suddenly, a very strange possibility appeared in his mind. Alan rented time in a small forensic lab downtown. He wanted to test a theory that sounded ridiculous, even to him. On the workbench, he placed three things: a clean glass plate, a nitrile glove, and a jar of very fine black powder used for developing fingerprints. First, he created a normal fingerprint. He pressed his bare finger onto a plastic sheet. The print left a thin mixture of oils and salts from the skin. Then he dusted the print lightly with powder. The ridges became visible immediately. This part was standard forensic technique. Next came the strange part. Alan rubbed the nitrile glove against a plastic surface for several seconds. The friction built static electricity, a triboelectric charge. He could hear faint crackling as the glove lifted away. Then he held the charged glove near the powder-covered fingerprint. Without touching, just hovering above the surface. Something surprising happened. Tiny powder particles began lifting from the fingerprint. Not all of them, only the lightest ones. They drifted upward in a faint black mist and clung to the charged glove. Alan repeated the process several times until the glove held a thin dusting of particles arranged roughly along the fingerprint ridges. Now he moved the glove toward the clean glass plate, still without touching. The electrostatic charge began pulling the powder away again. Particles jumped across the small air gap and settled onto the glass surface. Alan leaned closer. On the glass, a pattern slowly appeared. Not perfect, but unmistakable. Fingerprint ridges, transferred through air. No direct contact. Alan stared at the glass for a long moment, because if powder particles could move this way, then other microscopic residues could move too. Sweat salts, skin oils, any tiny aerosolized material. And if someone used a controlled particle generator, static electricity might not just move fingerprints. It might be able to build one. Alan invited the detective assigned to Daniel's case to the small forensic lab. Detective Miller arrived skeptical. He had seen hundreds of fingerprint cases in his career. The rules seemed simple. A fingerprint appears because a finger touches a surface. End of story. Alan placed a clean glass plate under a bright lamp. Watch closely, he said. First, he pressed his finger onto a plastic sheet. The ridges left a thin, invisible print made of oils, sweat salts, and microscopic skin debris. Most people think fingerprints are just oil, Alan said. They're actually a mixture of tiny particles. He dusted the print lightly with fine powder. Dark ridges appeared. Now Alan turned on a small particle generator sitting beside the bench. A faint stream of air flowed through the chamber. Inside, a plastic disc rubbed against another surface as it spun. Friction built an electrical charge, triboelectric charging, the same effect that makes a balloon stick to your hair. But here, it happened thousands of times per second. Alan held a nitrile glove near the charged airflow. Powder particles lifted from the surface and clung to the glove without touching it. Miller leaned forward. That's static, he said. Yes, Alan replied. But static electricity does something detectives rarely consider. He moved the glove toward the clean glass plate. The particles jumped across the gap and settled onto the glass. Slowly, a ridge pattern appeared. A fingerprint. Miller frowned, but that's powder. Alan nodded. Replace the powder with microscopic skin residue from an actual fingerprint. Charge the particles, then direct them toward glass. He tapped the plate. You can deposit a fingerprint without a finger ever touching the surface. Miller stared at the print forming on the glass. And if someone had a lab full of charged aerosol equipment? Alan finished the thought quietly. They could plant evidence that looks completely real. Once the physics made sense, the timeline started to rebuild itself. Allen and Miller returned to the research lab with a new perspective. The aerosol generator in Daniel's lab was not just equipment. It was the key tool. Triboelectric particle systems are designed to charge microscopic particles and move them through controlled airflow. They are used in research on pollution, filtration, and microdeposition, exactly the kind of work Daniel's project studied. Allen examined the generator's internal chamber. Inside, he found traces of residue that didn't belong to the official experiment logs. The particles contained tiny fragments of skin salts and fatty acids. Human fingerprint residue. Someone had run a deposition test using biological material. Then they checked the timeline. Security cameras showed Lisa entering the lab late the night before Daniel died. She carried a small sealed container from another building, Marcus's building. Marcus worked with polymer films used for fingerprint capture experiments. That meant one thing. A fingerprint sample from Marcus could have been lifted from plastic or tape. The microscopic residue could then be aerosolized and electrically charged. The generator would disperse the particles. Electrostatic forces would pull them toward the nearest glass surface, and the particles would settle along their original ridge patterns. A fingerprint transferred through air. No contact required. The glass chamber beside Daniel's body had been the perfect target surface. By the time Allen finished the reconstruction, the pattern pointed clearly to one person, Lisa. Her research records showed months of work on charged particle deposition. She understood triboelectric charging better than anyone in the building. More importantly, the grant records told a quieter story. Daniel had been selected to lead the next phase of the federal project. The decision had been finalized only 2 days before his death. Leadership meant control. Control meant funding, patents, and future contracts, millions of dollars. Lisa had spent 3 years building the lab's particle research program. If Daniel became director, she would lose control of the project she started. Allen looked again at the equipment logs. The aerosol generator had been used late at night several times during the week before Daniel died, always by Lisa's access card. The pattern suggested preparation. First, she obtained Marcus's fingerprint residue from the other lab. A lifted sample would be easy to collect from discarded plastic film. Then she used the aerosol generator to test the deposition process. Charged particles carrying ridge residue could be directed onto glass surfaces. Once she confirmed it worked, the final step was simple. Poison Daniel during a late experiment. Run the generator briefly. Deposit Marcus's fingerprint onto the glass chamber. A perfect suspect appears. Someone who had never even entered the room. Allen closed the file slowly. It was a murder built not with weapons, but with physics. The more Allen and Miller looked into the lab's research, the stranger the case became. Lisa had not invented the physics. Triboelectric charging and particle deposition were well known in material science. The same principles are used in powder coating, air filtration, and even some types of 3D printing. But one application kept appearing in the research papers: trace evidence transfer. Allen opened a recent conference presentation from Lisa's group. The slides discussed controlled electrostatic deposition of microparticles onto glass substrates. One diagram caught Miller's eye. It showed ridge patterns forming on a surface after charged particles settled from the air, not fingerprints specifically, but the shape was unmistakable. Allen flipped through the rest of the files. Several experiments explored how microscopic biological residues behaved in charged aerosol flows, sweat salts, skin fragments, organic oils, exactly the components that make up latent fingerprints. Lisa's work was meant to improve particle sensors, but the science had another implication. If charged aerosols could reconstruct ridge patterns on glass, then fingerprints were no longer strictly proof of contact. They could be manufactured. Allen looked at Miller. Imagine this technique in the wrong hands, he said. Plant a fingerprint at a crime scene, move biological traces across a room, reconstruct evidence using charged air. Miller exhaled slowly. That means this isn't just about one murder. Allen nodded. It means a fundamental assumption in forensic science might be wrong. The meeting happened in a quiet university conference room. Allen laid several objects on the table: a clean glass plate, a charged nitrile glove, and the small particle generator he had borrowed for the demonstration. Lisa sat across from him beside 2 university lawyers. Detective Miller stood near the door. Allen didn't accuse anyone at first. He simply repeated the experiment. Powder lifted from a fingerprint sample. Charged particles floated through the air. Slowly they settled onto the glass plate. A ridge pattern appeared. Even the lawyers leaned forward. Lisa watched silently. Allen then placed a photograph beside the plate, the fingerprint from Daniel's lab. Next, he showed the equipment logs, late-night use of the aerosol generator, Lisa's access card, the residue found inside the chamber. Finally, He placed Marcus's fingerprint record on the table. The particles we found inside the generator match biological residue from this print, Alan said calmly. No one spoke. Lisa folded her arms. That proves nothing, she replied. Alan nodded. You're right. It proves how the fingerprint was deposited. Her expression didn't change. Miller stepped forward. And the poison? Lisa looked at the detective, then at the glass plate where the artificial fingerprint still rested. She didn't confess, but for the first time, she didn't look surprised either. A week later, the lab looked exactly as it had before. The same concrete walls, the same glass chamber in the center of the room. Technicians cleaned the surface with ethanol and wiped it dry. Under bright light, the glass looked perfectly empty. No prints, no patterns, just smooth surface. Alan stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving. For more than a century, fingerprints have been treated as one of the strongest forms of evidence in criminal investigations. Courts rely on them. Detectives trust them. The basic assumption is simple. A fingerprint means someone touched the object. But physics rarely respects assumptions. Tiny particles can travel through air. Electric charge can move them without contact. Under the right conditions, a surface can collect the pattern of a fingerprint that never physically touched it. A ghost print built by static electricity. The science behind it is real. The experiment works. And the case of Daniel showed how dangerous that knowledge can become. Alan glanced once more at the glass chamber. It looked clean, but appearances can lie, which raises a difficult question. If a fingerprint can arrive without a finger, how many crime scenes have we misunderstood?